Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for this briefing and to discuss findings and recommendations from an overview of the so-called Operation Cast Lead. Today we will hear the findings and recommendations of three important investigations performed in the immediate aftermath of Operation Cast Lead, which was Israel's 22-day military offensive on Gaza. This took place from December 27, 2008 through January 18, 2009. Additionally, we're going to hear important views from the Israeli human rights community on the need for an additional investigation to be conducted by the United Nations Human Rights Council. Operation Cast Lead claimed the lives of many, many innocent civilians, including children. The loss of life was felt by both Palestinians and Israelis. With a population of 1.5 million people, the Gaza Strip is among the most densely populated territories in the world. The offensive exacerbated an already dire humanitarian crisis shaped by the Israeli-imposed blockade that effectively restricts the entry of food, clean water, fuel, and medical supplies. The blockade continues to restrict the entry of goods, including desperately needed reconstruction materials. The three reports that will be presented today make a compelling case that international law and the laws of war were violated during Operation Cast Lead. Regrettably, the United States government has shown little will to investigate what happened on the ground in Gaza. I think it's important to know the truth and to hold all parties accountable for any violations of law or human rights. The U.S. military operations in Fallujah, Iraq in 2005 invoked many parallels to events in Gaza, a densely populated territory that was cordoned off, difficulty distinguishing innocent civilians from combatants, the use of white phosphorus, and the subsequent harm and death of innocent civilians. Regrettably, our own government and our own government officials were never held to account for their actions in Fallujah. Without proper investigations and accountability, this type of warfare may become acceptable or even commonplace in conflict throughout the world. I believe the U.S. and our good friend Israel are capable of much, much better. Unfortunately, travel complications have prevented Mark Garlasco, senior military analyst at Human Rights Watch, from joining us today. In his place, we're delighted to be joined by Mr. Joel Stork, Deputy Director for the Middle East and North Africa Division of Human Rights Watch. And Mr. Stork's current work focuses on violations of international human rights and humanitarian law by states and armed groups, particularly in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and freedom of religion issues in Egypt. He lectured widely at universities and public forums in the United States, Europe, and the Middle East. His books include Erased in a Moment, Suicide Bombing Attacks Against Israeli Citizens and Routine Abuse, Routine Denial, Civil Rights and Political Crisis in Bahrain. After Mr. Stork, we're going to hear from Zahir Janmohamed, Advocacy Director for Middle East and North Africa at Amnesty International, who will present the report, Fueling Conflict, Foreign Arms Supplies to Israel-Gaza. Before joining Amnesty International, Mr. Janmohamed was part of the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy, where he organized conferences in Nigeria and Sudan on the democratization process. In 2002, he was a witness to the violence in Gujarat, India, that left thousands of Muslims dead. He's spoken at numerous universities and penned many articles in a number of publications. The third report, Onslaught, Israel's attack on Gaza and rule of law, will be presented by Noura Erakat of the National Lawyers Guild. Ms. Erakat is a Palestinian attorney and activist who traveled to Gaza as part of the National Lawyer Guild's fact-finding mission. She is currently an adjunct professor of international human rights law in the Middle East at Georgetown University. Lastly, we'll hear from Mitchell Plitnick, Director of B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. Mr. Plitnick will share with us some views from the Israeli human rights community, as well as speak about the importance of the United Nations Human Rights Council's investigation in Gaza and Israel. I want to thank all of you for coming here today. Your presence here is much appreciated. And perhaps we will begin with Mr. Stork, and we appreciate your presence and your filling in.
Well, thank you very much for your invitation to be with you today, and thank you for joining us. I should say at the outset that Human Rights Watch had people ready to go into Gaza within a few days of the start of the Israeli military operations there. Contrary to previous practice, the Israeli government refused to allow us access to Gaza via the Erez checkpoint. And in fact, to this day, they have not allowed us that access. We have nevertheless been able to get people into Gaza on several occasions via the Rafah crossing with Egypt, but we do have a remaining continuing issue with Israel in terms of access to Gaza, which in the past had not been a problem. We had people actually observing the conflict from the Israeli side of the border with Gaza during the actual the December 27th, January 18th period. Most of my remarks are going to be about the investigation we did into the use of white phosphorus. And we started seeing signs of this particular use of this particular munition from even before we got into Gaza and were able to investigate on the ground there. We could observe, my colleague Mark Garlaskow could observe from the border the telltale signs of this munition, which is basically, it's a substance of phosphorus-soaked wedges, sort of styrofoam-type wedges that are packed into a shell, a mortar shell, an artillery shell, that's then, fired by, delivered, shall we say, by whatever means. It produces a very dense smoke, so it's used by militaries around the world for obscuring purposes, for obscuring troop movements and the like. It's perfectly legal as a weapon. It's not a banned weapon, but because it has the, it's also a highly incendiary device, because this phosphorus creates the dense white smoke, because when the shell bursts and these phosphorus wedges are exposed to the air, they burst into flame when they come in contact with oxygen. They burn in a very intense degree. They produce the smoke, the desired smoke, but of course if they happen to land on an individual, a person, or an animal, or a structure, they burn. They burn very intensely in a way that is very difficult, in fact, to put out. So even though it is not a banned weapon, like any weapon, it has to be used in the proper way. I mean, you can use it legally and lawfully, or you can use it illegally and unlawfully. To get to the conclusion first, we found that in numerous instances, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, used it unlawfully. It was very interesting that in this period, beginning around January 8th, January 9th, so about a week into the fighting, in fact, more or less exactly at that point, after the first week of air assaults, when Israeli ground troops went into Gaza, that's when you started seeing white phosphorus use. And so indeed, one could correlate that and say, okay, it's being used for obscuring troop movements. The problem is that no matter what the purpose, it may be a perfectly legitimate military purpose, again, if it's used in a densely populated area because of its incendiary impact, it becomes an indiscriminate weapon, and it becomes unlawful. Before we go too far into the white phosphorus, let me just mention that it's not the only thing we've been looking at in Gaza. We've got a series of reports coming out on the fighting in Gaza, of which this was the white phosphorus was the first. The second one, which we released about a week ago, and I have several copies here. My colleague Valerie has them if you're lucky enough to pick one up today, called Under Cover of War, Hamas Political Violence in Gaza, which is about basically Hamas killings, extrajudicial killings and beatings and maimings of their political rivals in other Palestinians, in other words, in Gaza. We will be coming out in the coming weeks with a report that looks at Israeli use of actually a very highly precise weapon, namely missiles, guided missiles that are fired from unmanned drone aircraft. A very precise weapon, which from a military point of view, and even indeed from the laws of war point of view, in the abstract seems highly desirable because it's very direct impact, it has very low collateral impact. If you get your target, and it's a legitimate military target, the impact on civilians or civilian structures in the area is pretty minimal. So in that respect, it's potentially, I hesitate to use this word, so in quotes, a good weapon. But of course, it's only as good as the people who are pulling the trigger. And again, we found cases in Gaza where these weapons too were used to kill civilians, either targeting civilians or at the very least not taking proper precautions to minimize harm to civilians, which is also a violation of the laws of war. We'll also have a report coming out updating work that we've done on the Palestinian armed groups' use of indiscriminate rocket attacks against civilian areas in Israel. And we'll be looking at cases we uncovered in Gaza where the IDF, the Israeli forces, apparently targeted individuals who were carrying white flags or otherwise trying to convey their civilian status and were therefore not legitimate military objects. I think, sort of by way of a prelude to my comments on white phosphorus, we have a short video which we prepared, which was up on, perhaps you saw it on our website when we released the report, but it's just a few minutes long.
Yeah, why don't you start that, just dim the lights.
So the problem is that when it fell, it created fires, burned people's homes down, it lit up a hospital, it lit up the UN, they burned a UN school, and they ended up killing civilians with fire. Well, with phosphorus, it can be legitimate if you're using it to make smoke in an open area, but it shouldn't be used in a populated area. We're in the middle of Gaza City. Of white phosphorus, especially in central Gaza, very clearly violates the human protection. There's no question about it. You see it has a singular and visual zone. When white phosphorus is airburst, it looks like a jellyfish. This big puffy white head, and then all of these flaming tentacles reach down. It was clear. I mean, from the moment that I saw it, team finally got into Gaza on the 20th of January. We went to the other home in Beeline. 14 members of their family had been taken away, and a shell came into the house. When the shell exploded, 4 children were killed. The father was killed, and the mother was exposed to quite a bit of phosphorus. It was very clear that it was a phosphorus attack. I mean, first of all, there was a shell inside the hole. When phosphorus burns, it leaves kind of an orange residue wherever it hits. We also found a number of unexploded white phosphorus traps outside of the home as well. So we can see that there was a larger attack in this area. And U.S. school, minority school, was hit by white phosphorus. The airburst was such a blowout that all of the phosphorus had to come down within the school compound. So the shell opened up, the flames came down and causing the fire. Once that shell lets out the phosphorus, it keeps going. And in this case, it went into one of those classrooms, hit a woman, and killed 2 of the children. Looking at the level of guidance, you know within about a 30-meter area where that shell is going to go.
In terms of the school itself, the building, I mean, is it marked at all? Is it identified as a school UN building?
Absolutely. We have provided the GPS coordinates of every single one of our locations. They're clearly marked with UN insignia, flags flying, lights shining on the flags at night, and so on. It's very clear that these are United Nations installations.
The intentional use of a weapon to harm civilians is the forefront. In the case of the Sama rockets, the desire behind the use is actually to harm civilians. So not only those people who are launching the weapons on the Hamas side are guilty of war crimes, but also those people who are ordering the use are guilty of war crimes. Just because one side is violating the shooting does not justify a violation of the other side. The bill is still required under the laws of the world to employ weapons that can target only those military. Anyone who claims that the white phosphorus use was targeted against Hamas rocket firing just doesn't understand military tactics at all. It's just not the right way to do it. It's all white phosphorus. Let's see the serial numbers. Hold on, let me check the serial numbers. The same one, E1. What's so shocking and what's really problematic is that since you know the general area of coverage, when white phosphorus comes down over a hospital or over a UN facility, then you had to have anticipated what the cost is going to be. We have the forensic evidence, we have the witness testimony, we even have my observations from standing on the other side and watching it. But what we really need now is an independent international investigation that's credible in nature, that can go in, look at how this and make a determination.
Let me make just a couple of additional points. In fact, I think Mark, who was with us after all, did manage in the video to sort of give you the basic outlines that I could, in a much less interesting way, read to you. So let me just make a couple of points. First of all, we're not saying that all use and every time white phosphorus was used by the IDF in Gaza that it was unlawful. What we're saying is that in some of the instances that we were able to document, we found unlawful use. That unlawful use, that is the use of white phosphorus in densely populated areas, namely the neighborhoods of Gaza City, was actually in the last days of the war. The video showed the one UN school. It was not in Gaza City. It was north of Gaza City. It was January 17th, so a day before the sort of truce went into effect. The other serious incidents where the hospital was hit, the UN compound in Gaza City, apartment buildings and so forth, was on January 15th. So again, we're talking about the very last days of the war, and that's where we saw this unlawful use. It's also important to note, I think, that we started sort of raising the alarm about white phosphorus from around January 9th or 10th, when Mark was on the border and first observing its use. And it appeared from that vantage point to be being burst over the populated areas. And the initial Israeli response was, we ain't using it, we're not using it. Then there was sort of a clarification of sorts. Well, we may be using it, but we're only using it lawfully. We're only using it in compliance with the laws of war. And then sort of by the end of those military operations, again, the tune changed and, well, we're investigating any sort of possible misuse of it. That investigation came to an initial conclusion last week, April 22nd, when the IDF released the results of its so-called investigation into use of white phosphorus, as well as several other incidents and involving in the Gaza war. And, you know, basically, again, denial, denial, denial. So, again, I know my colleague Mitch is going to be talking about the need for investigations. I want to echo that on Mark's part. And again, it's important to know that what we saw, because of this pattern of, since, you know, January 9th or 10th, the sort of denial that was being used and saying, well, it's being used, but it's being used in compliance with the laws of war. I mean, the issues were known at the very highest levels of the Israeli command, and yet this stuff was used repeatedly as the war went on. So we're talking about not just issues of individuals who were responsible for firing those artillery shells, but for the people who gave them the orders, and for the people who set the policy. I'll leave it at that in terms of white phosphorus. I just want to make one other note about our work on Gaza, and that is that a big focus for us has been the Israeli blockade of the border crossings. And again, I have here, or my colleague Valerie has, copies of a letter that we sent this morning, actually, to Secretary of State Clinton regarding remarks that she made here on the House last week in an exchange with Representative Ellison, where he was pushing her on the issue of the Gaza crossings. And we found Secretary Clinton's sort of response simply inadequate. Let me just leave it at that. Let me turn it over to Representative Plitnick or
Thank you very much. At this point, we are going to hear from Zahir Janmohamed, the Advocacy Director for Middle East and North Africa at Amnesty International.
Thank you, Representative Kucinich, for your kind introduction and also for organizing this hearing. I also wanted to thank you, Representative Kucinich, for your courageous and strong remarks during the Gaza crisis. While various members of Congress spoke up about the humanitarian crisis, there are very few who spoke about accountability and specifically the probing of U.S. weapons, probe of U.S. weapons used by Israel in Gaza. And I want to appreciate you for that and hope that other members follow suit. In this presentation, I wanted to talk about a report, Fueling Conflict, Arms Transfers to Israel and to Hamas. But before I do that, I think it's important to paint a picture of what Gaza was like before the military offensive began in late December. Amnesty, along with about half a dozen other organizations, published a report in March of 2008 called Gaza, a Humanitarian Implosion. And I have a summary of it that I produced. I can give it to you after. But basically, what we did in the report in March 2008 was to show that the conditions in Gaza, even before the military strike happened, months before, had reached the humanitarian crisis. And I just want to quote a very small section of that report, just a few statistics. Carrying on to what Joe said, one of our main concerns and continuing concerns is about the blockade. There were a blockade of very crucial humanitarian supplies before the Gaza offensive, and it still continues today. So if you look at the number of people living in absolute poverty in 2006, it was 63%, so still a very high number. In March of 2008, when a report was published, that number had jumped to 80%. In 2004, households in Gaza were spending 37% of their income on food. In 2007, they jumped to 62%. And as of March of 2008, there were over 1.1 million, 3/4 of the population in Gaza, were dependent on food aid. That's a number that had jumped tenfold in 10 years. So when we look at the Gaza military offensive that began in December 2008, it really was an offensive on a population that had already been thoroughly beaten down. The conditions were just unimaginable. I mean, when I met with the researchers that had gone into Gaza throughout 2008, they struggled to describe the conditions when I met with them in November. Now, obviously, after the 22-day conflict, the conditions were even worse, and the conditions remain dire. And the three lingering conditions that remain. First is the humanitarian situation. The U.S. has done a great job of dispatching Senator Mitchell, which I think is a good move, and of allocating the $900 million in assistance to Palestinians. But much of this assistance still has not gotten in. Much of the critical assistance is still languishing at the border, both U.S. assistance and by other international donors. So that's one. The second is there's been very little discussion about accountability, and accountability is really the cornerstone of human rights work. And there's been very little discussion about accountability, and that I mean accountability for all parties to the conflict, not just Israel, but even Palestinian armed groups, and I'll speak about that in a moment. But really what I want to speak about today is about U.S. weapons. It's not often that we get called as an organization to speak about U.S. weapons and how they're used and misused, particularly by Israel, so that I'll take this opportunity to speak about that. And I think our responsibility to speak about our tax money in many ways funded this conflict and funded the weapons that were used. Now what Amnesty found was that U.S. weapons in some cases were used in legitimate purposes, but in many other cases in illegitimate purposes. Amnesty sent a team of researchers, including a British military expert, to Gaza from January 17th through February 4th. And I should just reiterate what Joe said. We've also had some difficulties in Israel not giving us access. We try to be very transparent in all our work. We are very transparent in our work, and Israel, restricted some of our movements, but they were able to enter through Egypt. And what we found was that, and this shouldn't come as a surprise, serious violations of international humanitarian law by both sides of the conflict. Civilians in Gaza were killed, injured, and made homeless in indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks by Israeli fighting forces. Medical personnel and facilities and civilians were directly targeted by the Israeli army with precision weapons. Again, sort of echoing what, like Joe said, Israel has some of the most precise weaponry in the world and some of the best optics and intelligence, and yet still there were blatant incidences in which civilians were targeted. I should also add that Amnesty sent a team, including our senior deputy director, to southern Israel as well, too, where they looked into attacks by Palestinian armed groups, including Hamas. According to our statistics, rocket fire by Palestinian groups resulted in 3 civilians and 6 Israeli soldiers killed in the conflict. Now, let me go over into our findings from report, which is outside, and I have some here, called Fueling Conflict, Foreign Arms Supplies to Israel and Gaza. So it comes as no surprise, the U.S. is the primary provider of arms, or largest provider of arms to Israel, despite U.S. legislation that restricts how what weapons can be used, and despite reports that many times Israel violates how those weapons should be used properly. We should note that the EU oftentimes has actually decreased the number of weapons it's supplied because of allegations of violations by Israel. But Amnesty's concern really is not about the transfer intrinsically of the weapons, but specifically when those weapons are used to commit violations. We can sort of look at the violations committed in Gaza in 2 broad categories, indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, and then precise attacks on civilians. Now, in terms of the disproportionate and indiscriminate attacks, one of our main concerns is something that Joe mentioned, and Mark has done some really great work at HRW on, is the white phosphorus, which is what Amnesty researchers found as well too, littered throughout Gaza was remnants of white phosphorus. And this is a concern that we continue to raise today, and we think that just as with the issue of cluster munitions, there should be a thorough investigation in terms of how white phosphorus was used in the conflict. But our team had also found fragments and components from munitions used by the Israeli army, many of them US-made, littering school playgrounds and hospitals and in people's homes. They included artillery and tank shells, mortar fins, and remnants from Hellfire and airborne missiles, large F-16 delivered bombs, many of them still smoldering, and highly incendiary white phosphorus, which I just mentioned. I know time is limited, so I'll try to fly through this. I've put in a lot of anecdotes, but you can read a report for some of the anecdotes. I'll just mention one case, because I think it's a very powerful case. It's of the very famous gynecologist Dr. Azzadin, who works at an Israeli hospital actually, and Amnesty delegates found fragments of the 120 millimeter tank shells, one of which was made in the United States, and there's a photo of it in a report. They were fired by Israeli soldiers into the bedroom of his daughters on the afternoon of 16th of January, and 3 of his doctor's daughters and his niece were killed in the attack on the spot, and there's some very powerful stories about that. Again, these are weapons that were made by the U.S., and it calls into question, we've raised questions with IDF, they haven't responded about what sort of alleged military gain was there in attacking his daughters and his niece. We've also investigated several deaths relating to flechettes. Flechettes they look like darts, they're quite thin, about this big, and oftentimes you'll have between 5,000 and 8,000 packed into a 120 millimeter shell. Again, this is indiscriminate, firing something like this on a densely populated civilian area where the flechettes spew out over a wide range of people, a wide range in a very densely built up area is unjustified. And now, one of the counter arguments that people say is that Hamas has operated out of urban areas, they hide between homes and things like that. Amnesty has corroborated this, that there are instances in which Hamas fired out of civilian areas, but one thing that our researchers found was that oftentimes Hamas would fire a rocket and then immediately leave the site, but the Israeli response to that would be hours later, again calling into question if that target was in fact legitimate. There were also examples of US Hellfire missiles. One of them was a 12-year-old boy, Omar, was standing near his home, indicating to the paramedic basically pointing out where wounded people were, and he was fired in the attack. One of the anecdotes our weapons experts spoke about was when a woman was hanging up clothes outside her home, at a very close range. She was hit by one of these missiles as well too. Again, calling into question a lot of things. First of all, one of the things that we say is that attacks should be on legitimate military targets. What we saw was, one, the use of indiscriminate weapons, and 2, oftentimes at close range, there were precise attacks on civilians. We know, of course, about the white flag killings when Palestinians were holding up white flags, and yet they were still targeted. These are examples that, rise to the level of war crimes, and they should be investigated. We've also spoken in the report about arms transfers to Hamas. There are all these allegations that Hamas sent over thousands of rockets. Our finding has shown that during the period there were actually 643. Nonetheless, we did send a team of several people to southern Israel to investigate these attacks, and we've called for, our calls are for investigation onto all parties of the conflict, including Palestinian armed groups. We've also spoken out against Hamas attacks on those that it alleges are collaborators with Israel as well too, when we published a statement about that about a few weeks ago. Now recently Amnesty put out a statement on the 1st of April about a shipment of US weapons to a US stockpile. So it wasn't to Israel, but it was to a US stockpile in Israel. And we had criticized the shipment because one of the things that we've been calling for, and I'll get to this in a moment in my recommendations, is that Amnesty believes there should be some review mechanisms. So just so briefly after the conflict, for the US to send weapons even to a US stockpile in Israel without some, because we had raised questions with the State Department, what review mechanisms are in place to make sure that before they're offloaded to Israel, that there are safeguards to prevent these weapons from being used as they were just used recently in illegitimate and illegal manners. And that's one of our main concerns that we continue to raise. Just as with cluster munitions, there have been some restrictions where we would like to raise the same concerns as well too, that there should be some review mechanisms, both in terms of the conflict and in future shipments. Now, in terms of our recommendations to Congress, there are 3 of them. First is on the humanitarian aid, and again, a lot of members of Congress have spoken out about the need to provide assistance to Gaza, but I think that assistance is only half the issue when it comes to the humanitarian. It's also about putting pressure on Israel to lift the blockade. And also putting pressure on Israel to allow Palestinians the access to livelihood, the access to enter and to leave Gaza, the access to seek employment. At one point, there were 25% of people in Gaza, leaving Gaza for employment, and now with so many factories and facilities destroyed, just giving aid is only going to be putting a band-aid on a problem. It doesn't address the issue of livelihood. So there has to be a comprehensive, it's not just a question of giving money. Israel has to cooperate by lifting the blockade. Second is about accountability. Again, this is a cornerstone of human rights work, and we did a lot of congressional advocacy meetings on this issue with the researchers, and when we went to congressional offices, there was oftentimes a lot of blank stares when we raised accountability. Well, we'll talk about humanitarian, but we're not going to talk about accountability. This is important. There has to be accountability. Otherwise, violence like this is certainly going to revisit itself. And the last is there should be a review of U.S. weapons. We've been in talks with the State Department about this. We'd like to see some more accelerated action by the State Department, but specifically review Israel's use of U.S. weapons during Operation Cast Lead. Where evidence exists that Israel's use of these weapons was in violation of U.S. law, the State Department should push for accountability. And second, that the U.S. should add restrictions to how certain U.S. weapons may be used in Israel, such as how previous restrictions were placed on cluster munitions. So sorry for the rest presentation. I have more materials here. I'm happy to give it to you after the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Next, we are going to hear from Noura Erakat of the National Lawyers Guild. You may proceed.
Thank you, Congressman Kucinich, to his staff as well, for organizing this much-needed hearing, especially because the U.S. government played a very close role in what happened, as Zahir has laid out, as well as Joe, in enabling Israel to commit several of these violations. The National Lawyers Guild traveled to Gaza between February 2nd and February 8th to investigate alleged violations of laws of war. Our delegation was comprised of 7 U.S.-based attorneys, 1 law student, and 1 documentarian. We had 3 specific objectives. We wanted to investigate whether Israeli forces deliberately targeted civilians and civilian infrastructure, whether Israeli forces used illegal weapons or alternatively used legal weapons in illegal ways, and thirdly, whether Israeli forces deliberately obstructed the movement of medical personnel. Unfortunately, we found violations of all 3 in our investigation, and rather than detail for you exactly what those were, I thought it may be helpful to see the pictures of those that we interviewed. I personally traveled, was part of this delegation, as was Reem Salahi, who's in the audience. And all the pictures that I'm about to show you are my own. All the stories I'll share with you are ones that were told to me. So with that, this is where we waited at the Rafah border it's the border between Egypt and Gaza. We waited here for about 3 hours outside, 6 hours inside. When we had help from the Egyptian army to get in, a connection in the Egyptian army, just to give you a picture of how difficult it is to get into this area, which is 365 square miles, housing home to 1.5 million Palestinian civilians. We often talk about Hamas in Israel, but in essence we're talking about Palestinian civilians living in Gaza. 3/4 of those 1.5 million civilians are refugees. And 86% of this population is dependent on humanitarian aid for survival. And so just to give you a brief context, getting in was incredibly hard, and UN rapporteur to Israel and the occupied territories, Richard Falk, notes that this was a particularly egregious attack in modern history because it represents the only war where those civilians who were caught in warfare did not have the choice to become refugees. And therefore, they only had the choice to be victims or survivors. As U.S. citizens, we had to get a waiver from the U.S. Embassy, waiving them of any responsibility for our life and limb. We're very well aware of the dangerous situation within the Gaza Strip. I want to share a little bit about international law with you. I know that it may not be as relevant to our government, but nevertheless, we should be aware of it. The law is unequivocal about the protection of civilians, And there are two basic principles, the principle of distinction and the principle of proportionality. The principle of distinction obligates an aggressive nation to distinguish between a combatant and a non-combatant. And in the case where that's not obvious, it should be presumed that the person is a civilian. The principle of proportionality doesn't refer to equality in the amount of firepower that's used, but instead refers to the amount of force an aggressive country is able to use in order to achieve its military objective. Any amount of force beyond what's necessary to achieve a military advantage is considered disproportionate. These same provisions apply to the protection of civilian infrastructure, and as you saw in the Human Rights Watch video, John Ging was describing how the UN, most known as civilian infrastructure, was also deliberately targeted. This is Zaytun. Zaytun is an agricultural neighborhood in northern Gaza, and it's home to people who are farmers. And as you can see here, what you see, this land that's absolutely flat, these were all homes. If you go, just to see the extent of the demolition, apparently after this operation, all homes except for those that were made into military outposts to be used by the Israeli army were demolished. You can see civilians have tried to make makeshift homes for themselves under sheets. Mosques were destroyed, as were 240 schools, 14,000 homes. The Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Health were all destroyed, as well as 60 civilian police compounds on the first day of the attack. This all effectively debilitated the society to return to normalcy after the war ended. I want to pause here and tell you the story of this gentleman. His name is Ibrahim Samoni. He lived in a home in Zaytun that he lived in with his son and 16 of their family members, so a total of 16. On the night of January 4th, Israeli warplanes began to shell all of Zaytun with missiles, forcing the residents of Zaytun into their homes. The next morning when they rose, they found that their neighborhood was filled with Israeli ground troops. And a few such troops came to Ibrahim's home with a sledgehammer, knocked down the wall, forcibly removed Ibrahim and his 15 family members and put them into an adjacent home where they remained without access to food, water, and basic medical goods. This alone constitutes a violation of the laws of war, which is supposed to ensure protection of civilians during warfare, which may be inevitable. After several hours, Ibrahim, his family, as well as the family that they were staying with, were again forcibly removed by Israeli soldiers. All of them were placed into the home of Ibtisam Samoni or Faris, where they joined about 120 other family members from the Samoni tribe. They stayed there again without access to food, water, and medical supplies in anticipation of what would happen next. And what happened came at 7 a.m. the next morning when a small rocket fell onto the home that was providing refuge to these 120 civilians. The rocket is known as a house tap. It's a small missile that ensures the accuracy of the projectile, as well as gives families within the home 5 minutes to evacuate. In this situation, these families were not given any time to evacuate, as a second missile immediately fell onto the home, destroying parts of it and killing 29 civilians, including Ibrahim's wife, Layla, his eldest son, Muhammad, and 2 of his other younger sons. Fortunately, the story doesn't end there. One of the walls that was destroyed enabled those injured who were not completely debilitated to flee. And they fled through the demolished wall and ran towards the city center. And as they ran, the Israeli forces who were stationed at the outposts shot live ammunition at the fleeing civilians, killing Ibrahim's grandson, Mu'tasim, who was in the arms of his mother facing forward. I'll be showing you a picture of Mu'tasim in a little bit. But just to continue the story, as this was a very well-known narrative, I mentioned that those civilians who were injured but not completely debilitated were able to flee. But there were at least 9 civilians who were injured who could not flee and remained among the bodies of the dead in the home. And because the International Committee of the Red Cross, as well as the Palestine Red Crescent Society, was denied access by the Israeli army to retrieve those injured, as well as remove the bodies of the dead, those injured civilians remained there for 4 days without access to any food and water among the dead bodies. And you may be familiar with the story, as it actually covered the front page of the New York Times when the International Committee of the Red Cross found the emaciated children near the bodies of their mothers, which you may be familiar with. It actually caused them, for the first time, to step out of their humanitarian apolitical role to call for an investigation into why their personnel were denied access. Once they were removed, they were not able to be removed with ambulances. Medical personnel were forced to remove the bodies with donkey carts without the donkeys, and had to travel 2 kilometers each way, and were not able to remove the bodies of all the dead. And the Israeli army prohibited personnel from removing those dead bodies for another 17 days. And this captures, this, by the way, is was a systematic practice that we found throughout our stay during our investigation. From the north of Gaza and Azbat Abd Rabba and Jabalia, through Gaza City, around Gaza City, this is Zaytun, through the south of Khuza'a and Khan Yunis, as well as Rafah, the very south, which was pummeled, as you know, because it's the site of many of the tunnels that are used to smuggle weapons, but have also been used to smuggle food goods during the blockade. The denial of access for medical personnel has also been documented by the Israeli human rights group Physicians for Human Rights. This is a violation of international law as well. It was part of our investigation, but the wounded and the sick in international humanitarian law are to be protected, and any tools or services that are used to ensure that the wounded and sick are protected are also protected and cannot be attacked. 7 ambulance drivers were killed during the 22-day offensive, and countless, or not countless, but dozens of ambulances were destroyed. But let me continue just to show you the pictures here. This is during the interview in Zaytun. This is Ibrahim's daughter and one of his sons. And at the bottom, you can see the picture of his grandson. If you click on the screen, you can move. There we go. And the reason we asked for these pictures, you might want to move. Actually, I'm not showing it to stir any emotions. The reason that I even collected this picture is because in our capacity as legal observers, we were obligated to request death certificates of all those that the families claimed to be dead, to verify those deaths, as well as pictures to verify the types of injuries, because, as you know, hospitals were destroyed during the attack, and therefore medical personnel could not conduct the autopsies necessary to verify any of these injuries. And so we have the picture instead to help us do that. Doctors who did treat Palestinian civilians in Egypt did verify that many of the civilians were shot at close proximity. Here you have the children playing with a bulldozer, ironically, where their home once was. And of course, I asked Ibrahim, was there any fighting from Zaytun that would cause this type of attack? Were you storing any weapons? And he pointed to the land behind him and said, we're a group of farmers, we have no part in this violence. Let me say that Joe mentioned that the Israeli army concluded its investigation last week on the 22nd. They do admit that they attacked this home with civilians and the civilians were killed, but claim that it was a mistake and they were trying to target the home next door, which was storage for weapons. And so, as a legal observer, I can only make 2 comments. And of course, as a practitioner of human rights law, 2 comments. One is, if the home storing weapons was right next door, then the civilians should have been moved to a home much farther away than they were placed. Secondly, if these are now countering narratives, those that are documented by HRW, AI, the NLG, and Physicians for Human Rights, against what the Israeli military has found, then that makes the need for an impartial international investigation even more necessary. And I know that Mitchell will address that. I do want to finish, but I want to show you a few other things. And if you can just speed through the pictures at this point, I want to show... wait, stop there. This is Ahmed. Ahmed is the 16-year-old son of Ibrahim, and during the interview he sat next to his father, and as I asked his father for the names and ages of everybody in the family, Ahmed said absolutely nothing except to comment, died, didn't die, died, didn't die, to describe his family members. And only after our interview was done, a social worker told me that Ahmed was among the 9 civilians left with the bodies of his mother and his 3 brothers for 4 days. And when they rescued him from the home, he was mute for an entire week from the trauma that he had suffered. And the trauma that Ahmed suffers is characteristic of most of the civilian population in Gaza. As you know, untreated will become post-traumatic stress disorder. As you know, has many negative side effects, including causing increased violence. And for those of us in the room who care about women, this is also a cause of increasing domestic violence in the Gaza Strip. And so making more imperative the need for psychological help in the region. I want to just end with the story of the American International School in Gaza. For those of us in Washington that are concerned and that are concerned with the population in Gaza, with its radicalization, with the influence of Hamas, and what have you, the American International School in Gaza represented a really progressive force. It was built in the Gaza Strip to educate children who then went abroad to receive their education from Ivy League universities internationally, including here in the US at MIT and Harvard. It taught an American curriculum. It was a co-ed setting. Everything that we would consider positive in a region that, at least here, we consider in need of dire help culturally and socially. Well, as you can see, AIS Gaza was destroyed during the attack. And the destruction was caused by missiles that fell directly onto the school. We know that it was a direct attack because nothing around the school was attacked. Not a single home, not a single road. No one else was killed except for the military 24-year-old guard on duty, the night guard on duty at the school. There were no other attacks. And so if we go to the next picture, this is a picture of Jabir Salim, who is the director and principal of the school. And if you ask him, well then why would they attack the school if it wasn't a site of fighting from where Hamas militants were shooting and it wasn't a site of storing weapons? And he said that the only reason I could think of is to deny these children education. Not in so many words, I'm paraphrasing, but we do have his interview on tape. The NLG has that for you to be able to watch. But as we walked around the ruins of the school, we saw Chinese checkers. We saw no remains of weapons. Here, Jebel picked up a yearbook from the rubble and was going through and nostalgically reminiscing where his alumni had gone on to study. These were the children that were to return to Gaza to help rebuild it into a positive society. And the background of the school, you can actually see Reem in this picture, and behind it is ruined soccer fields. If we can just skip really quickly, again, to this picture. Sabah, you saw her story, HRW documented her story, but they didn't tell you the details. Sabah was in her home with her 6 sons and 1 daughter, as well as her husband. When they asked for lunch, she was too afraid to make them lunch and said she would make them sandwiches. When she rose to make them sandwiches, white phosphorus missiles fell directly onto her home. She saw her husband and one of her sons decapitated. She described seeing 2 of her other sons melt to death. And here we saw her in the hospital where she was healing from her white phosphorus wounds, which she will surely heal from, but also the trauma that she now suffers from not being able to protect her children, which is very instinctive for women and men alike, the need to protect your children, not having a home to come back to, not having a job to go back to, not having a school to go back to. There really is nothing once she's released from the hospital to return to continue her life. And in the next picture, I just want to show you the extent of the white phosphorus and what it looks like. White phosphorus is not illegal. It's an incendiary weapon, but continues to ignite upon contact with oxygen. And that's why the use of it against heavily residential populated areas is illegal, because of the extent of harm that it causes. And the doctors said that they treated many of these victims as burn victims, and they returned a few days later with more serious wounds because the phosphorus had continued to burn. And so with that, I'll end. Thank you. Oh, and of course, maybe when it comes back, since I did go over my time, I felt it would compel to share the stories with you. The NLG has several recommendations to Congress, which I will share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mitchell Plitnick, Director of B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. Thank you very much.
There it goes. Thank you, Congressman, for holding this panel, for inviting me here, and for bringing up these difficult issues here in the House of Representatives. Today, of all the days to do something like this, today is Yom HaAtzmaut, the 61st anniversary of Israel's Declaration of Independence. The Israeli Declaration of Independence is, for me, an inspirational document. It has very high aspirations, very high ideals in it. B'Tselem, as Israel's leading human rights organization documenting human rights issues in the occupied Palestinian territories, works to bring Israel's behavior more in line with those ideals through that focus, and to enhance our own ability to bring about a better future through the rule of law and through respect for human rights. With the fighting in Gaza, the death toll, the devastation of the civilian infrastructure there, very disturbing questions were raised. You've heard about them in depth with the presentation of the 3 reports that you've heard just now. In the 3 weeks of that operation, over 1,400 Palestinians were killed, 13 Israelis were killed, over 5,000 Palestinians were wounded, over 800 Israelis were wounded. Tens of thousands of people were left homeless. Many thousands of buildings were destroyed. We know, and we've seen the images of the devastation of that fighting. But it's important also, I think, for us to understand that damage, death to civilians, and all of these things in and of themselves are not necessarily conclusive proof of war crimes or grave violations of international law. But when we see them this extensively, particularly as we saw in the Gaza Strip, obviously major questions are raised, and a full official investigation is warranted when you see that much damage to civilian life and infrastructure. In Gaza, the application of the principles of international humanitarian law and human rights norms is complex. It's a densely populated place. It is very difficult to have any kind of combat fighting anywhere in Gaza that would go on that civilians are not going to be placed in harm's way. That is just the nature of the terrain in Gaza. So we need to approach the question of investigations with that in mind. We need to take into account the full context of international humanitarian law as well as the unique circumstances in Gaza. For us and for many Israeli human rights organizations, our preference would be that Israel itself would conduct a credible and thorough investigation of what happened in Gaza in January and the questions that have been raised. It's not impossible. Israel's done this in the past. In the wake of the Lebanon war in the 80s, the Kahan Commission did conduct such an investigation, did indeed come up with quite a bit that was extremely critical, even indicting of the behavior of certain governmental officials, and came up with remedies for those things. It was generally acknowledged that the Kahan Commission's investigation was thorough, was credible. Most people around the world believed that it was done honestly and that Israel had held its officials to some degree of accountability. But now in 2009, the investigations that have been carried out by Israel have not met this standard or come even really even close. All the investigations that have been undertaken so far have been internal investigations by the Israel Defense Forces, and this is just not adequate. It should be obvious on its face that the military cannot investigate itself and come up with anything that is going to be seen as credible by anyone outside. It is not just a matter of trust. It's a matter of when it is the military and indeed the policies of the military that are in question, and I stress in question. They are essentially the accused. The accused cannot investigate his or herself. It just, simple logic tells you that nobody will accept if I'm under indictment and I investigate whether or not I'm guilty and I say I'm not guilty. I don't think it would really convince very many people. This is really no different. There needs to be an outside and independent body. Again, we would prefer that this would be done by Israeli civil society, certainly with the military's cooperation, but the military itself cannot conduct these investigations and come up with anything that's all credible. The questions that have been asked in these investigations are also the wrong questions. They pointed largely at whether or not individual soldiers acted in ways that were contrary to international law. And of course, that is a matter for investigation, and it is an important question, but the larger question is whether or not there were policies that were misguided, whether or not there was an atmosphere set by the upper echelon, even if it was not whether explicit or implicit, that led to violations of international humanitarian law, and of course whether or not such things actually took place. This is raised in particular because, as was reported recently in Israel, the words of the professor named Asa Kasher, who wrote the IDF's, Israel Defense Forces, ethical guidelines. And he has been quite clear and quite explicit in saying that our soldiers take precedence over their civilians. These are his words. When those are the guidelines that are guiding your army, it is an inevitability that war crimes and violations of international humanitarian law would take place. So we need to then, this certainly gives, I think, all the impetus one needs to say, we really do need to look into this given the results of what happened in Gaza. The bottom line is that the Israeli military's responsibility in fighting in Gaza or in anywhere else, wherever they may be, and is no different than that of any other army. They are required to do everything that they reasonably can to avoid harm to civilians. The question of whether or not you've done that, I think, was framed very well by certain human rights thinkers in Israel, who said, ask yourself if you would take this risk, if you would take this action, if the civilians who were putting at risk were Israeli. That should be the standard that is held by any army, not just Israel's. The need for a credible investigation that looks at the actions of both sides, I think, is very clear. As has been pointed out several times, the Hamas rockets, the Qassam rockets that Hamas used during the fighting and have been using for years and have been using since, among other groups, were directly targeted at civilians. This can be a matter for investigation, but there's not much of an investigation needed because no one really denies this on either side. So that is clearly a war crime. And anything that is not, any approach to Israeli actions that is not taking that into account will not be considered a credible investigation. When the United Nations Human Rights Council initially set out a mandate for investigation of the fighting in the Gaza Strip, their mandate only included Israeli actions. And we found this objectionable for 3 reasons. One is that, just on the surface, it is inherently unfair in any time that there's conflict to only investigate one side and not the other. If you're familiar at all with the history of warfare, there's virtually no country or group that has fought on either side in any war where some violations do not take place. And there's always gray areas in international humanitarian law and the laws of war. There are always places that you need to know what the context was, what was going on, what was the other side doing in order to know whether or not this side committed a violation of international law. Secondly, if the mandate only includes investigating Israel, there's no reason for Israel to cooperate with such an investigation. There's no incentive for them to cooperate with an investigation that only targets them. And thirdly, as I said, you need to know, and it's particularly true in Gaza, because there are many accusations flying around from both sides and against the other. You need to know exactly what each side did in order to evaluate the criminality of the acts and the violations, potential violations of each side. Without knowing the context, we can't know what one side or the other might be guilty of. But the United Nations, so we objected to that formulation, but the United Nations Human Rights Council reevaluated this and chose a team that is very credible, very esteemed, and is led by Justice Richard Goldstone, a South African jurist who has an outstanding reputation, who is universally respected by people from all different countries, all over the world, all different walks of life, all different political persuasions, has the experience of having led the tribunals, war crime tribunals regarding Rwanda and Yugoslavia, as well as investigating the Iraq Oil for Food program. Goldstone himself is a trustee of the Hebrew University and has long-standing connections with Israel. This is, and he leads the team. The other 3 members have equally strong reputations in international law. And this team is very credible, very reasonable, and Goldstone's presence was only secured with the promise that that the mandate of this investigative team would change, that it would be to investigate both sides equally, and to come in with no preconceived notions about who did what wrong. We're going to go in, we're going to look and see who needs to be held accountable for what exactly. Such an investigation, in our view, is in the interest, obviously, of the Palestinians, but also very much in the interest of Israel and of the United States. The question now is whether or not Israel will indeed cooperate with the investigation. They have not said one way or the other whether they will or won't. They're apparently considering it. Several media reports have indicated that they won't. The motivations for them to cooperate with this investigation, there are several. In general, most of the world is convinced of virtually every charge that has been leveled against Israel. That kind of limits how much Israel would have to lose in an honest investigation then. But also, if Israel does not cooperate with this investigation, then it will be much more difficult for this team to conduct a truly fair and balanced investigation, because they won't have access and they won't have the resources that they need to fully investigate what might have happened in southern Israel. They won't have the full access to veterans of the Gaza war that they could talk to give them a fuller picture. They will still likely be able to get into Gaza and do their investigation there. Hamas has announced that they will cooperate with the investigation. So again, I think for a balanced picture to emerge, Israel is well advised to cooperate. The other problem with Israel refusing to cooperate and not in the end producing a credible investigation is that it leaves open the very strong possibility that other countries will pursue legal measures against Israel and Israeli officials. So all in all, I think this is a very, very good option for Israel to pursue. Specifically, what we'd like to see is an investigation of the following. Whether or not civilian objects were the target of attack, even though those objects did not contribute to Hamas's military actions, whether the army acted in accordance with the principle of proportionality, which Noura explained earlier, whether soldiers fired at civilians without justification, whether soldiers used Palestinian civilians as human shields, whether ambulances and medical teams, while carrying out their medical duties, were attacked, whether there was delay in evacuating and treating injured persons in areas in which the fighting had ceased, and whether there was any use of prohibited weapons, whether generally prohibited or prohibited under specific circumstances. And on the other side, the team would investigate the firing of rockets at Israeli civilians, the firing at soldiers from inside civilian neighborhoods, thus endangering the lives of the residents, storage of weapons inside civilian structures, the execution of Palestinians suspected of aiding Israel and as well as being political opponents of Hamas, the continued holding of Gilad Shalit as a hostage, and whether or not Hamas militants forced civilians to serve as human shields and made improper use of ambulances and hospitals. The current team, as it is assembled, is capable of investigating all of these things on both sides and coming up with a report that says what went on. And this addresses really the claims against both sides. That's what an objective report should do. We should keep in mind that international humanitarian law does not depend on reciprocity. So if we find that one side violated international humanitarian law, that does not in any way mean that the other side was justified in their own violations of international humanitarian law. The actions of both sides, however, are needed for the context to understand the actions of the other. So we are very much hoping that the United States will help to urge Israel to cooperate with the Goldstone team. It's in American interest because getting Gaza both rebuilt as well as healing the open wound that the Gaza war is essential for American diplomacy in the region and for any hope for progress towards a better future for both Israelis and Palestinians. And in that vein, B'Tselem, along with Rabbis for Human Rights in North America, have sent a letter to Secretary Clinton asking her exactly that, to support the UN's investigation and to urge Israel to do the same, pointing out that, yes, we understand that Israel is uncomfortable with the United Nations Human Rights Council. That council has got a history of focusing almost exclusively at times on Israel, and their initial mandate for this investigation, as I said, was objectionable. But that's not the case now. And the team that has been assembled is the basis on which we judge whether or not it looks likely to be a fair and credible investigation, not whether or not they're mandated by the UNHRC, which in the end is not the body that's conducting the investigation. This team can do that. It can help us move past Gaza, and it can help us all heal. So I am hoping that we can find a way for our country to help in this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Plitnick. At this point, we're open to questions from the audience. For any one of our panelists, direct your questions to the individual you want to respond. Yes, sir.
I guess my question is for Mr. Plitnick. I'm Dan Pollock with the Zionist Organization of America.
You too.
And the question is, I'm a little bit confused about two things about the Goldstone group. First of all, is it not true that didn't he sign a condemnation during the war of Israeli conduct before he was appointed to the commission? If so, how can it still be a nonpartisan, fair commission? And secondly, do you really think that Israeli decision makers won't be indicted following the findings of a commission? And if so, how is that still in Israel's interests?
My understanding is that the letter that Goldstone signed was calling, again, for, it was raising the possibility of grave violations of international humanitarian law and calling for investigations into that. It was not prejudging. It was saying that there's real cause for concern and expressing concern about the enormous damage that was being done to civilians and civilian infrastructure in Gaza. The results of the investigation can't be known right now. I don't know what they would be. I don't know if it would open up Israeli officials to indictment or not. That's why we need an investigation. However, let's assume for a moment that you're right, and that indeed it would open up Israeli officials to the potential for indictment in the International Court. Does it still serve Israel's interest? I would suggest that yes, it does, because absent that, there are already moves, as I'm sure you're aware, in a number of European countries to hold Israeli officials on trial in the same way in their own countries under the principle of universal jurisdiction. The only way that universal jurisdiction does not get applied in general is when countries investigate themselves. That is, again, our first preference, and we expressed this also in our letter to Secretary Clinton, that our first preference is that Israel would do this investigation by itself. I think that is the optimal situation. If it will not, then at least you are looking here at a team that is going to be fair to Israel, as opposed to others who might be already deciding the outcome and decisions of a case beforehand. So I think that is then the second best choice. And yes, it's better than leaving Israeli officials just open to indictment at random in various other countries. We already know, again, I'm sure you're familiar with the stories of Israeli officials who have landed in Britain and then had to leave because they were afraid to get off the plane. They were afraid of being arrested because cases have been made against them. This is not a way for Israel. Israel cannot continue to exist that way. I don't think that's the best course for Israel. I don't think it's the best future for Israel. And I think the better course is standing up for what's right and standing up for the ideals, as I said, that are expressed in Israel's own Declaration of Independence, among many other Israeli resources.
Just a small point on that. I think whatever the Goldstone Commission ends up concluding, it itself would then make recommendations. So what would happen? Who would anybody be investigated or indicted? Who would bring the indictments and so forth? That's a matter for a court to do in the end. And I suspect that if the commission found, did recommend investigations, criminal investigations and criminal indictments, the first, first address for that would be Israel itself. And then, of course, if Israel failed to follow on that recommendation, then it would open up the possibilities of it, taking place under sort of universal jurisdiction rules. But the first address would be Israel, and Israel would have, a chance then to address the matter itself in its own military justice system.
Yes, question.
Yeah, it seems
Can
like
you stand up so we can all hear you?
Sure. It seems that the Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and the NLG representative talked about the use of weapons and potentially the illegal use of weapons. And I was wondering, as U.S., because we are the #1 funder of military aid to Israel, if the Arms Export Control Act and the Foreign Assistance Act have been triggered, and if so, what is Congress, or what should Congress be doing now, as well as the Obama administration?
Well, I'll answer something there, because I sent the first letter to the Secretary of State under the last administration, asking for an investigation under the Arms Export Control Act. We didn't get any response. We sent a follow-up letter to the Secretary of State under this administration. I don't believe we had a response yet, Kate? And what was the response, essentially?
That they take the end-use of U.S. weapons very seriously. But beyond that, there's really been no response.
Yeah, I think the information that is made known in these reports will be the subject of a follow-up letter from me to the Secretary of State, asking for them to take note of the evidence that's been gathered and to come to some conclusion about what's been presented. I'm not going to let them ignore this. I mean, it's just not going to happen. This isn't going to go away. We need a response from our government as to what is the position of the U.S. government with respect to weapons that are used by other countries in conflict for purposes other than which those weapons are intended. This has to do certainly with the conflict in Gaza, but it has to do with other matters as well. So we will persist in this. Noura?
I would like to add something to that. I didn't get a chance to mention this, but one of the primary NLG recommendations to members of Congress is precisely what Congressman Kucinich has taken the initiative to do, which is to request from the State Department an investigation into Israel's compliance with the provisions of the Arms Export Control Act. The AECA is U.S. Code 22, starting at Section 2271, and it lays out the provisions in which, how foreign countries can use U.S. supplied defense articles and services. And those uses should be limited to legitimate self-defense, internal security, UN peacekeeping, development projects, amongst other permissible uses. Now, although legitimate self-defense and internal security have not been defined, we feel that the confluence of the various investigations, the evidence that we've gathered, at least warrants an investigation, and it does trigger both the AECA, the Foreign Assistance Act, and additionally, the 1952 the U.S.-Israel Multilateral Assistance Agreement. So we're not even talking about international law here. In fact, we're talking about compliance with U.S. domestic law as well.
And I want to add that, you've had 3 different reports, all of which seem to agree on certain points in terms of what the findings were. So we'll see that those are presented to the State Department in a formal way, and then we'll take it from there, and we'll keep you all posted on what the responses of the State Department. Another question, yes?
Me?
The lady in the back, and then we'll go to you.
My concern, there is an obvious lack of transparency, and then the use of white phosphorus and the gross civilian casualties in this engagement should be profoundly disturbing to the international community, and I do think it demands further investigation. My question is, when we're dealing with a non-traditional conflict, as is the case with Israel and Hamas at this moment, it's not the Palestinian people that they're after. What is an acceptable means of interaction as far as you're all concerned? I remember the policy of targeted assassinations in the late 1990s used by Israel. And while it seems to me, if you're going to use violence, like an effective way to do it, it caused incredible outcry on the part of the international community, though they were going after known terrorists and people who were guilty of crimes against humanity. What is a way that we can target those on both sides who are guilty of gross crimes and let both societies move forward?
Anyone want to?
Yeah,
let's start with Mr.
I mean, I think the example of targeted assassination is a very pertinent one. Here you have, you're targeting presumably people you know for certain are guilty of acts of violence and murder. However, Israel doesn't have a death penalty. That amounts essentially to a summary execution. So that seems questionable even under Israeli law. But I think more to the point, the targeted assassinations sound very clean and precise. In point of fact, virtually the overwhelming majority of them injured or killed bystanders, civilians, those who were with the target, etc. So this is not, that would not be an acceptable method. The fact that this is an untraditional war, I mean, it is true that I think, you know, and I think, I hope, I don't know whether other folks will agree, it's up to them, but in my view, international law needs sort of constant updating, and it certainly does need updating now to deal with the laws of war as it is now fought today. And that's part of what we're doing here, actually. We're saying that because there's new modes of warfare does not mean we throw the old rules out the window. It means that we need to update them to take into account present-day realities. Having said that, plenty of those old rules work just fine right now. The questions of the points that have been brought up in terms of distinction and proportionality work. They still work, and they do bind, in fact, Hamas. I mean, this is not just a matter of Israel being the only one that has to abide by these rules. Whether it's a government or what's called a non-state actor, they are still bound by these basic rules of customary international law. Whether or not they've signed any treaties to that effect or are signatories to the Geneva Convention is irrelevant. They are still bound by these laws, and they're very well applicable. And I think, especially given that today fighting tends to take place a lot between either two non-state actors or a regular army and essentially militias or guerrilla groups in heavily populated areas, I think those basic principles of distinction and proportionality are even more important. And following them is absolutely crucial to avoid some of the really ugly things we've seen, not only in Israel and the occupied territories, but in Chechnya, in Sudan, in so many other places around the world.
Yeah, could I agree with Mitch's comments on the targeted assassination issue. I just want to point out what may be obvious, but you know, it wasn't Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch that drew up the Geneva Conventions. It was, you know, it was people in the Pentagon, in the State Department, and their counterparts from around the world who got together at the end of World War II and worked out a treaty. So it's military establishments that drew up their own rules for themselves, to police themselves, basically. So I also agree with Mitch that they're not necessarily perfect, and you know, maybe there should be changes made, although I'd be cautious about that. That's sort of like, it seems to me, opening up the U.S. Constitution for rewriting. I'm not sure we necessarily want to go down that road. I think it's also important to remember that the principles that Noura put up on the screen of distinction, you have to distinguish fighting forces, and this goes for Hamas as well as Israeli army or anybody else, has to distinguish between civilians and combatants, and civilian objects and military objects. It also has to observe the rules of proportionality. It has to, and indiscriminate attacks that because of the weapon used or because of the situation in which the weapon is used, like white phosphorus in densely populated areas, cannot distinguish between civilians and combatants. And you know, those are the basic rules. Now it's true that in the fog of war situation, sort of applying those rules can be difficult. There will be lots of gray areas, and that's why you need this kind of investigation by professional investigators. But you know, in terms of new rules and so forth, if we could get some compliance with the old rules, we'd be you know, a long way on the road. I think the problem is you know, the problem is accountability. The problem is enforcement, and that's the long road we have to get started on.
So I just want to add to that, because I feel like part of your question was also what Israel should do in order to protect itself, essentially. So.
What Palestine can do to support itself, because the West Bank is doing.
Well, okay, so let me address this, because now you're getting into context, which we didn't discuss much here. But let me just talk about quickly, just reiterate what my colleague said. Common Article 3 of the 4th Geneva Conventions refers to non-state actors as well. So the law has been written with this in mind, with what we may be seeing and calling asymmetrical warfare. That's one. Secondly, in terms of what Palestinians can do and why the West Bank is so different than Gaza, I don't know, because we didn't discuss the history of Gaza. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza, but maintained control over the borders, the airspace, the seaport, ingress and egress of all commodities, as well as the movement of civilians, and in effect remained in control. And one would say that the occupation remained. In January 2006, the Bush administration compelled Palestinian civil society to engage in elections they weren't ready for. And because of that lack of readiness, Hamas won overwhelmingly the seats in the Palestinian Legislative Council. But that victory didn't represent a vote for an Islamic state, but instead represented three things: a vote against the failed peace process, a vote against Fatah's corruption, and a vote in part that was the result of poor political planning by Fatah, who in some cases ran 2 candidates in municipalities where Hamas only ran 1. In June 2007, and this is documented by David Rose, I think, in Vanity Fair, October 2006, he describes the US's involvement in trying to enable Fatah to oust Hamas from power. Now, I can't verify that, it's just something that I read, but it's something to consider. It's what David Wormser, who was then the chief Middle East policy advisor to Dick Cheney, said that what it seems to me is that Hamas staged a preemptive coup before Fatah could oust it. So here we're talking about a situation, and directly after that, the EU, the US, and Israel imposed a blockade. So we're talking about a situation that was not a matter of circumstance, but rather a matter of design. We've helped to create a situation that's very unstable. And the most recent war has destabilized it even further, leaving now 1.5 million people who have nothing to return to, and not even a mosque to pray in, let alone a school to study in or a job to go to the next day. We are creating a situation where we can't enable that civil society to police itself, to protect itself, and to abide by its own rule of law. So in terms of there's a lot Palestinians can do, but there's a lot that our government can do to help them get there.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask this question. In March of this year, we at Code Pink took a delegation of 60 women into Gaza. When we were, I also brought in a whole bunch of those baskets, those gift baskets, 1,000 gift baskets that we gave to the women in Gaza. Now, the ability to take those things across the border made me see the arbitrariness of what we can and cannot get in. Like, for example, right now I'm trying to arrange to build 3 playgrounds inside Gaza, because I saw the lack of any playground or any play areas for children there. Most of the schools that I saw were destroyed, like the one I saw, that school with the white phosphorus. And I realized I'm unable to get certain things in that are like a playground. Yeah, how can that be used as a weapon? Or how can that hurt anyone? And I'm just wondering, how can we open this up to rational decision-making, thought, cooperation, rational talk on this subject? Because I know some women, they go and they make a presentation about Jewish women, about what's going on in Gaza, and they get immediately called Israel bashers. You know, immediately it goes to this far side of the issue. All we want to do is know why the Gazan people can't have food, medical equipment, playgrounds. Can anyone address that?
Yeah, sure, no problem. I'm glad you raised that. I mean, it is true. It is very arbitrary in terms of what food is and isn't getting in. And I mean, it's kind of embarrassing that Senator Kerry had to raise the issue of pasta. And, and Israel is not allowing pasta. I mean, it's embarrassing that figure so well known as him would have to raise that in these official diplomatic meetings. One of the things that I will say is that after our delegation came back from Gaza, we had a military expert. We met with about a dozen offices on the House side and about a dozen on the Senate side. And all the offices that we met with were very receptive on the humanitarian issue. If you have any specific information to give to congressional offices to raise, then they can then ask them to raise them directly with the State Department. We've been giving information about various shiploads and containers or groups that have been trying to supply some information. So after, I'll give you my contact information. But we're trying to relay that to the State Department, because then they can say, well, this group is trying to get these supplies in. That would help a lot. And that's where we've found more movement in Congress in terms of support. And of course, Representative Kucinich knows more about that.
Thank you. Gentlemen.
Me? Yes, thank you. Paul Verdine with the Washington Interfaith Alliance for Middle East Peace. I appreciate the conversation, if you will, that Congressman Kucinich has sponsored today. And in listening to your views on the investigations your own organizations have conducted thus far and what you hope will happen with the UN Human Rights Commission, do you think it's possible, and I'll ask this of Mr. Plitnick initially, do you think it's possible for an investigation of the violations of international law, laws of war, of U.S. law, or of basic human rights as defined in the Geneva Conventions and so forth? Is such an investigation possible without taking it into the context of the 42-year occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and of East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights and the violations of international law inherent in those occupations and the human rights violations that have been perpetrated against the Palestinian people over the last 42 years? Thank you.
Well, I mean, you know, with any investigation of human rights violation anywhere, right, there's always history, and it can always go back to, you know, the beginning of time. If that, you can always stretch it back that far. At the same time, I think Noura is correct in that, you know, the situation in Gaza cannot be investigated completely without the surrounding context. For example, just you know, in terms of the access to medical services during the fighting, you cannot understand that without understanding the closure of the borders and things like that. So clearly, a certain amount of context needs to be there. But I don't think it has to go back to you know, the beginning of the, you know, the conflict of the earliest days of Zionism and Palestinian nationalism, or the creation of the State of Israel, the dispossession of Palestinians, the occupation in 1967. I think you can look at this without dealing with all of the history in its entirety. I think you can look at this just in terms of the conditions that are existing now. I also think that it's a key point in international law that wars happen, occupations happen. That's why we have international humanitarian law. It's not, it's there because we know these things are going to happen and we want to manage them so that they do as little harm as possible. So I do think that it's important to be able to investigate and look at and build a case for conducting war properly, for conducting, if you will, an occupation properly, according to the laws of war, without necessarily having to get into the whole political question of the roots of that war and that occupation. Doesn't mean that's not a good thing to do in and of itself, but I do think you can do just that part. Yes.
I want to thank Mitchell Plitnick, the director of B'Tselem, Noura Erakat of the National Lawyers Guild, Zahir, Janmohamed of Amnesty International, and Bill Stork of Human Rights Watch for being here today for this briefing on Gaza and also the respective responsibilities of both Israel and Palestinians, in particular Hamas, with respect to violations of law and human rights violations. I really feel that this briefing is going to be instrumental in moving forward the discussion about matters of accountability and justice. And I appreciate the fact that each and every one of you have taken 2 hours out of your day here to engage in this discussion and to listen. Thanks again to the members of this panel. And we will continue our discussion on this, and we'll report to you when we have any response that merits our getting together. Thanks again.